The Resident Evil franchise is 20 years old. That's 20 years of dodging zombies, seeing stars, and using increasingly impractical objects as door keys. But the series as it is today is almost unrecognisable from the one that debuted in 1996, with amazingly ropey live-action sequences and spectacularly awkward tank controls. In some ways, that's good, and to be completely expected. Resident Evil, as it was, simply wouldn't sit well with today's audience. But I think most people's problem with the franchise and how it's evolved over the years isn't the fact that it has changed over the last 2 decades, it's that the tone and spirit of later Resident Evil games feels so radically different from their predecessors. All they really share now is a name and a couple of the core characters and monsters. Where exactly did it all go wrong? Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3 were all quite similar in both style and execution. Code Veronica, released for the Dreamcast in 2000, was the first Resi game to change things up from the traditional pre-rendered backgrounds of its predecessors, in favour of real-time 3D environments. And 2 weapons in the game, the sniper rifle and the linear launcher, could be fired from the character's point of view. In 2000, the series was already considered dated enough to warrant a GameCube remake of the original game, by its own director Shinji Mikami no less, who felt that it hadn't aged well and that the new, at the time, hardware could help him bring a remake more in line with his original vision. It again switched out pre-rendered backdrops for 3D models, but also significantly upgraded the graphics from previous titles and also added in different mechanics, including a new Type-C control scheme and the introduction of Crimson Head zombies, harder enemies that would come back to life in the place of normal foes you'd previously killed. Later in the same year the remake was released, Resident Evil 0 hit the shelves. Its gameplay was similar to the games that had come before it, but it was unique in that it had a refreshing strategic system whereby players could instantly switch between its 2 protagonists, swapping items and weapons on the fly or via environmental puzzle solving when they were forcibly separated. Other Resis featured multiple player characters of course, but Zero's take on the feature was far more flexible and immediate. When one character was not being controlled by the player, it was handled by the game's AI. This mechanic, unobtrusive as it is in Resi 0, comes back with a vengeance in later Resident Evil titles and, if you ask me, is one of the biggest contributing factors to the franchise's decline. Resi 0 and the remake were both well received by critics, the remake even more so. But its sales were underwhelming, which directly led the franchise's development team to shift focus on subsequent titles away from the slower scares of survival horror and towards a more action-oriented approach. The result was probably the biggest turning point in Resi's history, Resident Evil 4.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
I like to think of 4 as the sweet spot between Resident Evil's traditional mix of survival horror and puzzle solving and the newer games' tendency to go full-on action apeshit. Leon S. Kennedy might be able to roundhouse zombies in the face, but he also had to call upon his wits to open obscure doors on more than one occasion. The most instantly recognisable change, however, was the switch from fixed camera angles to a third-person over-the-shoulder viewpoint. Which makes total sense when you consider the improved gunplay, but which arguably robs the game of a lot of its more cinematic scares. When, for example, the player can see something the character cannot, but can't move the camera to investigate further. Everything in Resi 4 was designed to quicken the pace, from the context-sensitive controls that would allow you to jump out a window or kick down a ladder, to the new abundance of ammo and much quicker, smarter enemies like the Ganados. Resident Evil 4 might not have been like the Resident Evil games that had come before it, but it was still a great game, one that sold well and became one of the most influential titles of the early 2000s. But, crucially, Resident Evil 4 still understood the value of tension and atmosphere, 2 essential horror elements that the later numbered Resident Evil games just seemed to forget about.
A little rough, don't you think?
Resident Evil 5 continued 4's focus on action and removed a lot of atmosphere by setting much of its story, even more than 4, during the day. It also highlighted a problem that, admittedly, Resident Evil had had for a long time. Its boss fights almost always involved enemies just growing extra insect-like limbs and additional squishy bits that the player would dutifully have to shoot at until one of you died.
I think that's what got Alpha Team.
And then there's your partner. Resident Evil 5, like 6, supports cooperative gameplay, and so you're always accompanied by another agent who, whether you're playing with another person or the game's AI is taking control, will move to protect or heal you should the need arise. How can you be spooked by a game's atmosphere when a brainless AI companion is spraying a first aid compound in your face or getting stuck on the scenery while you're lamenting your inability to run and shoot at the same time? Horror, any kind of horror, works best when you're alone and vulnerable fighting against the unknown. And it's hard to feel really threatened when you've got two characters armed to the teeth and ready to fight enemies you've seen umpteen times before over the course of the franchise's 20-year history. Of course, the same problem is repeated with Resident Evil 6, except now you've got 3 sets of partners to swap between. It's getting a little crowded in here. By this time, Capcom was wise to many fans' grievances about the direction of the series, and so tried to please everyone by designing different scenarios in 6 to fit around the different styles of play that had emerged within the series over the years. A valiant effort, but it just made 6 feel like a muddled mess that tried to please everyone while giving no one what they really wanted. Now in 2016 we have spin-offs like Operation Raccoon City and Umbrella Corps that only barely warrant the Resident Evil name. But at the same time, we have the episodic series Resident Evil Revelations that, while continuing the trend of protagonists moving in herds, is possibly the closest the series has gotten in an age to recapturing its old sense of spookiness. So where exactly did Resident Evil go wrong? The truth is, a lot of the elements that make up a Resi game today, the constant company, the focus on gunplay, the repeating enemies, have been there longer than you might think, and they're probably going to stick around too. But never fear, us old school Resi fans still have our memories of how the series used to be. We'll have to pry those from our cold, dead hands. Pick up the gun!
Ether, I swear,
Pick up the gun!
What do you think I'm trying to do here?
Pick up the gun! What's wrong with you? Why don't you want to pick up the gun?
I don't know. Oh, please stop.
Why won't
please
you pick
stop.
up the gun? Pick it up!
What? Ether, I don't know what to do. Why is it not? Why won't it let me? May I remind you, Ether, of the time slightly earlier in this video when you were all... Silent Hill 2 is well regarded as one of the finest video games ever to grace
It is.
this,
It's not its fault you can't play it.